This bill is the place for this particular amendment or this debate, and would strongly oppose the gentleman's amendment. And understanding he has receded his time, I would also rescind mine.
The gentleman from Indiana yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from North Carolina. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 55, printed in House Report 113-170. For what purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 55, printed in House Report number 113-170, offered by Mr. Mulvaney of South Carolina.
Pursuant to House Resolution 312, the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Mulvaney, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina.
And I'll yield myself 2 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for doing this at such a late hour as we approach midnight. Very briefly, this amendment is very similar, almost identical to a similar amendment that Mr. Van Hollen and I offered during the National Defense Authorization Act several weeks ago. We've added a couple of co-sponsors. We've added Mr. Kaufman, a Republican, and also Mr. Murphy, a Democrat. But in addition to that, we've made some important changes to the amendment. What does the amendment do, first of all? The amendment simply seeks to take the OCO budget back down to what the Pentagon asked for. The Pentagon asked for roughly $81 billion. The committee saw fit to give them $86 billion, and we think that maybe letting the Pentagon decide how much the Pentagon needs for OCO is probably a good basis for discussion, and it is the basis for this amendment. There's one exception to that, Mr. Chairman, and this is where the important difference from the last amendment several months ago comes in, which is there was some concern. Mr. Van Hollen and I believed it was ill-founded, but there was some concern as to whether or not the previous amendment prejudiced in some fashion the National Guard. While we disagreed with the National Guard's position, we respect it. So for that reason, that specific reason, there is explicit language in this amendment that excludes the National Guard from this reduction. So instead of going all the way back down to where the Pentagon asked for, we're giving the Pentagon what they asked for plus the $1.5 billion for the National Guard. So for folks who had some difficulty with our amendment a couple months ago because they were concerned about the impact of the National Guard, even though we thought that was, again, ill-founded, we have sought to protect that in this particular amendment. So to sum up, Mr. Chairman, what we're asking for is simply what the Pentagon asked for in the first place with extra protections for the National Guard. With that, I'll reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. For purpose, the gentleman from New Jersey rise.
To claim time in opposition.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in opposition.
Mr. Chairman, I rise to oppose the gentleman's amendment. Budgeting for contingency operations, especially 1.5 years in advance, is very difficult. Goodness knows the war on terror in Afghanistan and what we did in Iraq, we never knew how long we would be there and how expensive it was. For example, despite having a higher overseas contingency allocation for fiscal year 2013 of $87 billion, budget execution during fiscal year 2013 has proven that that request was understated by as much as $10 billion. As a result, to the extent possible, funds for OCO are being cash flowed from baseline funds which have already been squeezed due to the sequester, resulting in profound readiness implications. Ships are not sailing, planes are not flying, and civilians are being furloughed. We've heard a lot about that on the floor today. Additionally, I think all of us know that we're exiting out of Afghanistan. The timetable may be a year or two, or maybe the Commander-in-Chief will decide to expedite our departure. Transportation costs spike as men and equipment are moved and deployed, and God only knows things can happen on the travel route. We've heard a lot about that on the floor too. Things can happen in Pakistan that might require additional expenses, billions of dollars more if we have to move men and material by aircraft. Contractor costs spike as many functions, such as dismantling forward operating bases, some of that's occurring now, and disposing of excess material, are turned over to the private sector to complete. And of course, the reset of equipment carries a very high price tag. So there are a lot of reasons that this money is needed. I strongly oppose this amendment. and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New Jersey reserves. The gentleman from South Carolina.
I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Maryland for 2 minutes.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank my colleague, Mr. Mulvaney from South Carolina, and our colleagues for offering this bipartisan amendment. Just last month, Secretary of Defense Hagel and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff testified before this House as to the amount of money that would be necessary to support the war in Afghanistan and our overseas operations, the so-called OCO account. And what they told this Congress was that the President's request of $80 billion was the amount necessary to accomplish our objectives and to support our troops. And yet this defense spending bill that's before us adds another $5 billion that was unasked for and unnecessary. So if there are extra monies stuffed into this account, why are they put in this account as opposed to somewhere else? And the answer is it's a very clever accounting scheme, because the other account, the base budget for defense spending, is subject to a cap. But monies for the war account are not. So every dollar you somehow put into the war account is a dollar that escapes the cap. And so you can put lots of dollars into that war funding account, even though they have nothing to do with supporting overseas operations. So I give the committee an A for creative accounting, an F for truth in budgeting. So what this amendment does is says to the military, we're going to provide you the funds you asked for, but, as the gentleman from South Carolina said, we're going to actually add $1.5 billion additional for the Guard and for the Reserve. But there's no reason we should be throwing money into the war accounts that don't belong there simply as an accounting scheme to avoid the cap. And I reserve the balance of our time.
And gentleman, South Carolina reserve.
Be reserved.
Gentleman from New Jersey.
Before I close, let me just say for the record, the $5 billion extra was in the National Defense Reauthorization Act, which the House passed, I believe, in June. And just for the record, funding for the Overseas Contingency Fund in our bill matches the amount recommended by the House Budget Committee, which membership is well known and is present on the floor this evening. So it's had a pretty good endorsement, and for this reason I strongly oppose the bill.
The gentleman reserve his time.
And I do not reserve my time. Yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In closing, I thank my friend for the opportunity here today. I would simply agree with him that it is difficult to plan out 18 months in advance as to what's going to be happening in Afghanistan. However, I would think that the folks best suited to be able to do that planning would be the folks who are actually running the overseas operations. It would be the Pentagon, it would be the armed forces, who are the folks who asked for the $81 billion that we are giving them. To Mr. Van Hollen's point, the Secretary was here saying this is exactly what he needs. I recognize the fact there could be contingencies, but you've got to think that that number is already built into the request. More importantly, the additional money, the slush fund, the money over and above the $80.7 billion that the Defense Department has asked for, is not saved for a rainy day. It's not saved for some contingency that we haven't anticipated that might come up in the next 18 months. It's spent. It's spent. So we simply ask for support for this amendment and try and get us back in line with spending the amount of money the Pentagon asked us to spend, respecting the integrity of the base budget, the 302Bs, but also not using up money in a wasteful fashion during the OCO account. And with that, I yield back the balance. Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from South Carolina. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The agreement. What purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey rise?
Request a roll call, please, Mr. Chairman.
Roll call is requested pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18. Further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from South Carolina will be postponed. It is now in order to consider amendment number 56, printed in House Report 113-170. For what purpose does the gentleman from Mississippi seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 56, printed in House Report number 113-170, offered by Mr. Palazzo of Mississippi.
Pursuant to House Resolution 312, the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Palazzo, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Mississippi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
My amendment is very simple. It prohibits the Air Force from making changes in fiscal year 2014 until 60 days after Congress hears from the Commission we established a report on the global structure of the Air Force. Over the last 2 years, Congress and the Air Force have engaged in numerous discussions about the future of our forces. I've had an opportunity to engage in many of those conversations about what the Air Force can afford, what provides us the greatest capability, and what ensures that our men and women get home safely. These discussions have included decisions the Air Force has made regarding the realignment of forces. Some of these decisions made a lot of sense. Some of them did not. But as we've had these conversations, as these decisions are being made, I can't help but feel like I'm listening to the Air Force play the same broken record over and over again. Because what I see happening, Mr. Chairman, is the Air Force continues to talk about cutting costs. They talk about mission capabilities and readiness. And then they turn around and spend millions upon millions of dollars rebasing planes and uprooting personnel all over the nation only to reevaluate and move them again just a few years later. And in the end, it seems like the Air Force isn't making smart financial decisions. And some of these moves don't even make sense from a mission perspective. Last year, my colleagues and I addressed some of these issues during the National Defense Authorization Act process. We included language in the House version of the bill that would have stopped movement of some of these planes until the Air Force could provide better answers for their decisions. I was disappointed that the final version of the bill omitted this amendment. Instead, the final bill established a national commission on the structure of the Air Force for the very purpose of reevaluating these basing decisions and reporting back to Congress. Specifically, we're looking for that commission to tell us if or how the current Air Force structure should be modified to best fulfill mission requirements in a manner that is consistent with our available and limited resources. The commission was also given several considerations to keep in mind while completing this study. They wanted to ensure that structure meets current and anticipated requirements of the combatant commands, achieve the appropriate balance between active duty Air Force and reserve components, provide sufficient numbers of active Air Force to ensure we can recruit from the pool for reserve components, and make sure we maintain an adequate peacetime rotation force. I'm encouraged by the formation and the progress of this Air Force Commission in last year's NDAA. In fact, I went and testified before this commission earlier this afternoon. I think they have some valuable contributions to make in these discussions. But I'm still disappointed that the Air Force is still determined to enact those questionable decisions before hearing from the Commission. If this body doesn't act, those decisions will go into effect in October of this year, moving hundreds of planes, uprooting families, transferring units, modifying missions, spending millions of dollars, possibly to rethink it all and rebase again in a few short years. Yet the Commission's report is only a few short months away. Am I the only one who thinks this doesn't make much sense? We are making bold decisions on the structure of the Air Force without waiting for the recommendations of the study that we mandated. This is a plain-as-day example of putting the cart before the horse. My amendment would simply call for a temporary freeze on Air Force movements until we can review the findings of the report. I feel like this is a pretty reasonable amendment given that we asked for the study in the first place. At a time when our military is already under incredible strain, when budgets are already tight, it is imperative that we get this right. My amendment may even save us money in the long run. I ask that my colleagues support this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Mississippi reserves. What purpose does the gentleman from Indiana rise?
To claim time in opposition to the gentleman's amendment.
The gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 5 minutes in opposition.
I appreciate the gentleman raising the issue about the Air Force's total force plan that was contained in the fiscal year 2013 budget. The subcommittee would agree that, looking back, it was poorly conceived and was made even worse by the lack of communication between the services, the reserve, and Congress. And I supported, and the subcommittee supported, and the Armed Services Committee supported, a requirement that the Air Force go back and reevaluate its force restructuring. But I ran for Congress, and I'm a member of the House of Representatives, and we're elected to make decisions. I'm not a member of a commission. I don't support commissions, and I'm disappointed that at the insistence of the other body, the Armed Services authorized another commission. I find it interesting that often we say we need a commission, we need a select committee. Each time there's a difficult decision to be made, we ought to make them. That's what we get paid money for. We ought to make those decisions and not give it to a commission. And what happens when we give it to a commission? Well, that's a bad idea. We don't support the commission's decision. And then that report sits on a desk. The gentleman mentions that the time is short. We have but a few short months before the commission's report is due back to the United States Congress. The report is due on February 1st, 2014. That means that we have the short month of August, the short month of September, the short month of October, the short month of November, the short month of December, and the short month of January before the Commission reports back to the Congress, before the Congress can begin to act now 2 years after a botched report by, I would admit, the United States Air Force in the first instance. The gentleman mentions that budgets are tight. I absolutely agree with him. All the more reason why, if the Air Force now has a plan to wait more than another half year to look at a report to decide what we're going to do, we ought to see what the Air Force has to say, if it makes sense to do it, if not to make them have it change, but not wait for the Commission. I'm a member of the House of Representatives, not a Commission. I would yield to the gentleman from New Jersey.
The gentleman, Mr. Vukowski, for yielding to me. I reluctantly rise to oppose the amendment. It seems that this amendment attempts to reopen issues that were resolved in the 2013 bills and would prohibit the Air Force from conducting authorized rebasing actions until April 2014. This amendment appears to be not so great for the National Guard. The National Guard is depending on rebasing actions or remission or backfilling units that otherwise would lose aircraft. I think that needs to happen, and I don't think it necessarily needs to happen after the receipt of this report, which is due sometime in the future. I appreciate the gentleman yielding.
Appreciate the gentleman's remark and would reserve my time.
Gentleman from Indiana reserves. Gentleman from Mississippi.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate my colleague's remarks. But the Air Force has a very bad track record of doing this every few years. And what they're doing is they're spending millions upon millions of dollars. They're talking about cutting costs, but all they're doing is moving planes around, rebasing them, spending more money on capital investment, basically upsetting communities that have given their heart and shared everything that they've had in support of our armed services over and over again. And I hope eventually that the Air Force can get their act straight and that they will be able to figure out a strategic and structural plan that will save taxpayer dollars. And that's what this is about. We're living in a time of limited resources, and I know there's a lot of people out there that want to do Americans harm, and we have to have our national security forefront and center because as our top priority. But I just wish the Air Force would continue disrupting communities all around this nation. I ask that my colleagues support this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Mississippi yields back. The gentleman from Indiana.
I would yield back my time.
The gentleman from Indiana yields back. Questions on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Mississippi. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 57, printed in House Report 113-170. For what purpose does the gentleman from Mississippi seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 57, printed in House Report number 113-170, offered by Mr. Palazzo of Mississippi.
Pursuant to House Resolution 312, the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Palazzo, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Mississippi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
This is a very simple amendment that corrects what I believe was a simple oversight when exemptions were laid out for sequestration. In July of 2012, OMB offered an exemption for all military personnel accounts. I believe that decision was driven by a desire to relieve all uniformed, deployable military personnel from the furloughs that were caused by sequestration's damaging defense cuts. Unfortunately, a very specific group was left out of this exemption because of a technicality. Our nation's National Guard and Reserve military technicians, our MilTechs, are some of the most important assets we have to keeping our servicemen and women safe. Just like any other service member, they proudly wear the military uniform to work and are expected to abide by the very same standards. Perhaps most importantly, every one of them is deployable. MilTechs are National Guardsmen and Reserve personnel. Many of them have deployed to Iraq, Afghanistan, and have been in harm's way all around the world. These dual-status technicians work every day in direct support of our warfighters. They supply our troops with the equipment they need to fight and win and return home safely. But because of a technicality, because they are paid out of a different account, these Guardsmen and Reservists have been on furlough for almost a month now. All my amendment would do is ensure that these men and women receive the same treatment as our other uniformed personnel are included in the furlough exemption. The Congressional Budget Office has verified that my amendment is budget neutral. And let me say that I was one of the first on the House Armed Services Committee to sound the alarm about the damaging effects of these cuts to our national defense. I have supported several alternatives that would resolve this sequestration mess around our defense budgets and across the federal government. I have lain awake at night worried about the damaging effects these cuts will have if we do not prioritize cuts and fix this problem. I hope we will see some consensus on a real fix to sequestration soon. But the exception has already been made for the men and women who put their lives on the line every day to defend this nation, and rightly so. My amendment simply ensures we include all of our deployable men and women in uniform in that exemption. This legislation is supported by our enlisted and commissioned National Guard members and many other organizations. I ask that my colleagues support the legislation, and I reserve the balance of my time. And, Mr. Chairman, I would like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Nugent.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank gentleman Mr. Palazzo from Mississippi. This is a simple fix to a problem that is an oversight, and I will tell you from the state of Florida's perception. I live in Florida. We are obviously prone to hurricanes. Our National Guard are our first responders when it comes to a natural disaster like a hurricane. These dual-status technicians that are in a position to keep the men and women of the Florida Army National Guard up in flying those helicopters that are utilized across the Gulf Coast to rescue people. Without these dual service technicians, without these women and men who actually repair and keep the equipment running, we are at risk, particularly in the state of Florida, but all along the Gulf Coast, when we can't field a force to go out and protect us here at home, much less out in the world. And our National Guard, and particularly aviation unit in my hometown that's affected, they're currently deployed in Europe. But the fact that they have the inability to keep their equipment maintained, and we're furloughing these dual service technicians, and it puts us at risk. It hurts our readiness. And so from a Florida perspective, I will tell you that it is imperative that we pass this. I really appreciate Representative Palazzo from this great state of Mississippi to bring this forward, and with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Mississippi.
Reclaim my time.
Reclaims his time.
I want to thank the representative from Florida. He brought up a good point. It's not just our dual-purpose technicians, our MilTechs, making sure our equipment that our warfighter needs is operating, and many times they deploy with them to Iraq and Afghanistan on multiple deployments and hot spots all around the world. But there's another purpose of our National Guard, and that's helping us here in the homeland. We're in the middle of hurricane season, and I know the fact that Congressman Nugent's governor, my governor, Phil Bryant, The governor of Louisiana, of all, sent a letter to the President of the United States asking for this exemption as well, because those are the first responders. They're there before the storm, during the storm, and after the storm. So I thank him for bringing that important point up. And I'd like to close by saying, in times of bitter partisanship and gridlock, the one unifying trait of this Congress is that we keep our promises to the young men and women who tirelessly defend this nation at home and abroad at great personal sacrifice. A vote against this amendment is a vote to break faith with our military and their families.
Time has expired.
A vote for this amendment is a vote to uphold our promise to our military and their loved ones. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. I yield back.
Gentleman, time has expired. For what purpose, the gentleman from Indiana rise?
Rise in opposition to the gentleman's amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in opposition.
I would, first of all, want to suggest that I appreciate the gentleman from Mississippi raising the issue relative to the Guard, as well as my colleague from the state of Florida. The Guard protects us internationally as far as our military and international threats, as well as takes care of us at home. The gentleman mentioned, given their portion of the country, that it is hurricane season. It is tornado season in the Midwest. It is flood season in the Midwest. It is earthquake season every day in the state of California, and we have wildfires out west. The Guard does terrific work. I am very proud of the fact that although Indiana has continued to decline relative to other states and is now only the 16th largest state by population in this great republic, the Indiana National Guard is the 4th largest Guard unit in the United States of America. And it's not just numerical, it is the quality of the men and women who serve, just as in the states of Mississippi, Florida, and throughout our country. But I would, again, reference back the observations I've made on all of the furlough amendments that have been made tonight. Everyone who does civilian work, whether it be at the Department of Defense or any other agency of this government, does important work, and we ought not to make that distinction. The gentleman who has spoken in favor of this did vote for the Budget Control Act that did create sequestration, that did create this problem. I would suggest that what we ought to do is comprehensively begin to solve this problem and not move chairs around on this particular deck, and I would yield back my time.
The gentleman from Indiana yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Mississippi. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 58, printed in House Report 113-170. For what purpose does the gentleman from Alabama seek recognition?
I have amended that to desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 58, printed in House Report number 113-170, offered by Mr. Rogers of Alabama.
Pursuant to House Resolution 312, the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Rogers, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Alabama.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In light of the late hour, I'm going to synopsize my more full statement, if that's okay with everybody. Recently, the House passed the FY14 NDAA, and in that document, we included a provision that before the $75 million that the White House has requested for implementation of the New START Treaty, they have to provide to the Congress the 1042 report, which was due 18 months ago by law, that outlines how they're going to spend the money. The White House has refused to submit that report to date. We put in the authorization language saying, give us the report and we'll give you the money. I went to Chairman Young and asked him to include this in his appropriations bill. He said he would welcome the amendment. I hope that's still the case tonight, and I urge my colleagues to support my amendment.
Does the gentleman reserve?
Yes, I reserve.
The gentleman from Alabama reserves. What purpose does the gentleman from Indiana rise?
I rise to claim time in opposition to the gentleman's amendment.
The gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 5 minutes in opposition.
I rise to claim time in opposition to the amendment and would state my opposition to it. We have a handful of amendments that have been made in order on the bill regarding our nation's nuclear weapons stockpile. This is one that urges maintaining the status quo, and others have pushed for a reduction in the number of nuclear weapons. I firmly believe that a further reduction in the number of nuclear weapons in our inventory will not negatively impact our deterrence goal. Even under the recently ratified New START treaty, both the United States and Russia will have more than 1,500 deployed warheads each. Additionally, the treaty contains no limits on non-strategic nuclear weapons or non-deployed nuclear warheads. With regards to the amendment, I don't think it's responsible to prohibit the United States from carrying out the reductions prescribed by the New START treaty. That bilateral strategic arms reduction treaty was passed by a wide margin in the United States Senate according to the Constitution, and it remains in force. I think it is very bad policy to go back on an international treaty obligation that would in fact reduce the number of nuclear weapons in this world. And would, again, reference back a quote that I read in my opening statement, because again, the gentleman is essentially saying, let us maintain the status quo. Over the last 12 years, it has gotten us a more expensive military that has grown more expensive, but has not gotten any larger. The reality that we face today gives us very difficult choices that we are going to have to make looking forward. Our military is at a familiar crossroads, one they have been at before at the end of combat operations. The additions and subtractions to funding that we make today must be carried out with an eye to the future. The status quo will no longer get the job done, one, as far as our national security, the security of this world, or a responsible budget that does truly, looking forward, provide us with an affordable defense. And for those reasons, do object to the gentleman's amendment and oppose it, and I would reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Indiana reserves. Gentleman from Alabama is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the gentleman's observations, and while I may not agree with the New START treaty, I am in no way trying to prohibit it being implemented. It is the law of the land. However, we do have a constitutional obligation in this House to be responsible with the taxpayers' dollars. And under the new treaty law that was signed by the President, he had 90 days to provide the Congress a report on how he was going to spend the money to implement it. That's all we're saying in this amendment, is when he gives us the report by law that was due 18 months ago, we'll give him the money, but not until then. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman from Alabama yields back. The gentleman from Indiana is recognized. Gentleman yields back. This question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Alabama. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 59, printed in House Report 113-170. For what purposes, the gentleman from California seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 59, printed in House Report number 113-170, offered by Mr. Roybacher of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 312, gentleman from California, Mr. Roybacher, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
I yield myself such time as I will consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
And I ask my colleagues to join me in supporting my amendment, which would eliminate all American military aid to Pakistan. Since 9/11, the United States has given Pakistan over $25 billion, with over $17 billion going to their security forces. These funds have been and continue to be used to fight an internal war of suppression against the Sindh, the Baluch, and others who reject their corrupt and brutal domination by Pakistan. Sadly, Pakistan also uses billions of American military aid to support terrorist attacks on its neighbors, including Afghanistan. And in this last decade,
our generous gifts to Pakistan have been used to finance the killing of Americans, both military and diplomatic personnel. We've been acting like suckers. No shame on Pakistan for being two-faced and murderous. Shame on us for being so stupid in financing a regime that obviously despises us and considers us its enemy. It is a charade to believe that our aid is buying Pakistan's cooperation in hunting down terrorists when the Pakistani establishment not only gave safe haven to Osama bin Laden for 10 years, but jailed Dr. Afridi, the courageous man who pinpointed bin Laden and was instrumental in bringing justice to him, the mass murder of our fellow Americans on 9/11. Dr. Afridi is an American hero, yet we have left Dr. Afridi to rot in a Pakistani dungeon. Shame on us for letting Dr. Afridi languish in misery and pain for helping us bring justice to Osama bin Laden and those he murdered on 9/11. Pakistan is not a government in which we should be giving billions of dollars of aid. My amendment would cut off all aid because Pakistan has betrayed our friendship time and again. Any money we send them only strengthens their ability to act against us, to murder Baluch and Sindhi and Sikhs, and to undermine moderate Muslims in Afghanistan even as we withdraw in 2014. At a time of tight budgets, we should reserve our aid for our friends and our allies and end assistance to a government that targets and kills Americans. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California reserves. Is anyone member seeking recognition? The gentleman from Indiana.
Rise to claim time in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 5 minutes in opposition.
The Secretary of Defense, I'm sorry, let me start again. Section 9114 of the bill specifies the certification required of the Secretary of Defense in order to execute the coalition support funds reimbursement to Pakistan. The Secretary of Defense must certify that Pakistan is cooperating with U.S. counterterrorism operations, not supporting terrorist activities against the U.S. or Afghanistan, taking measures to curb the export of IED materials and preventing the proliferation of nuclear materials. As mentioned earlier this evening, the relationship with Pakistan has always been difficult. It is a gray world, but maintaining that relationship is essential. It has helped the United States make progress against terrorism, and Pakistan has allocated a significant part of their forces within their own borders to the counterterrorism mission. In June of 2012, Pakistan demonstrated its commitment to a stable and secure Afghanistan by reopening the ground lines of communications. I certainly regret that previously they had been closed. But this has eased tensions with the U.S. and improved logistical support for our troops. I do think withdrawal of assistance at this time is likely to polarize Pakistan and exacerbate significant pro- and anti-American rifts within their military and their government generally, and I don't think we need to aggravate a very sensitive relationship that can, in the future, be more productive to the United States. And we'll be happy to yield to the gentleman from New Jersey.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. And I rise to oppose the gentleman's amendment, but understand, because we're good friends, his passion and his very, very strong feelings, which he expresses on any number of occasions and has done so eloquently tonight. Let me say, and some would argue this isn't true, but I believe it, Pakistan does remain a key U.S. counterterrorism partner, and their cooperation is essential. As we withdraw from Afghanistan, we're going to have to use, as we did during the war in Afghanistan, we're going to have to use air routes over Pakistan. We're going to have to use their maritime capabilities. We're going to have to use the land routes to get our troops and material out. Otherwise, we're going to depend on Kyrgyzstan and Russia. It's going to be damn expensive. it's going to be expensive anyway, but it'll probably be $20 billion worth of expense to withdraw from Afghanistan if we don't have the cooperation of the Pakistanis. So, and the other issue is that Pakistan is a nuclear power, and I think we need to have a close working relationship with them to make sure that those weapons in the future never fall into the wrong hands. So I appreciate the gentleman's remarks. I associate myself with him, and I strongly oppose this amendment, but obviously respect the sponsor for his strong views as well. Thank you.
Appreciate the gentleman's remark, and as he mentioned, do appreciate the passion that the author of the amendment has brought to this. Obviously, there have been problems, and it is incumbent upon this country to make sure that this is an arm's length and adult relationship that is, in the end, beneficial to our nation. So I certainly appreciate his objective, but am opposed to his amendment. I would yield back my time.
The gentleman from Indiana yields back. The gentleman from California.
The gentleman noted that this is a gray world. It is not a gray world in so many cases. This is not a gray world when people are killing Americans. This is not a gray world when someone who organizes the slaughter of 3,000 Americans on 9/11 and then is given safe haven by someone who's claiming to be our friend. No, that's not gray at all. The Pakistanis have decided a long time ago that they consider us their enemy. When they took Osama bin Laden and gave him safe haven from us and took our money while they were doing it, and took our money and used it to finance terrorist groups that have murdered American soldiers in Afghanistan. No, that's not a gray world. That's black and white. And we should stand up for the principle that people who are killing Americans will not receive American military aid. And that's how we can proclaim that tonight in this resolution, and I ask my colleagues to join me in standing up to make sure that the world knows that when they kill Americans, they're not going to be treated like they're our friends. We're not that stupid. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 60, printed in House Report 113-170. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the table.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 60, printed in House Report number 113-170, offered by Mr. Stockman of Texas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 312, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Stockman, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
I yield my time as much as I may consume.
Without objection.
This is an important amendment in that the Chinese have demonstrated time and time again that they're willing to take our tactics, our technology, and coming up in 2014, President Obama invited the Chinese to participate in RIMPAC exercise, the world's largest international maritime exercise. Right now, the Chinese plan to use these exercises to increase their knowledge about our tactics. The participation in these military exercises are particularly concerned at this time when China is hacking our computers, stealing our weapon plans, and escalating the pressure in the South Sea of China. China's behavior does not appear to be even on the radar of the administration, and I'm really concerned now that they're becoming a belligerent in the Pacific area of the Rim. They're declaring rights to land, and we are going to by participating with the Chinese, make it look like we're siding with the Chinese and help really the Chinese allies and against the United States. And I at this time, would like to yield some to my friend that's the co-sponsor, the gentleman from California. I yield him as such time as he may consume.
I rise in support of this amendment and offered by my good friend from Texas. The Chinese Communist Party is a gangster regime that rules over a billion of its subjects. It is the world's worst human rights abuser and does not deserve the recognition nor the legitimacy that comes with participating in military exercises with the armed forces of the United States. as the greatest threat to world peace and stability, the last thing we should be doing is trying to fine-tune and helping them fine-tune their military and their familiarization with their military, with the strengths and weaknesses of America's armed forces. The Chinese military is the armed wing of the Communist Party in that country. For decades, China has occupied Tibet, East Turkestan, and threatened the democratic nation of Taiwan with total annihilation. The Communist Party uses force to control its population. Thousands of Falun Gong practitioners who do nothing more than promote yoga and meditation have had their organs ghoulishly ripped from their bodies before they were executed so that those organs could be sold. The moral depravity of the Chinese Communist Party cannot be overstated. China is aggressively using military expansion to back up territorial claims against India, Japan, Taiwan, Vietnam, the Philippines, and other countries. The Chinese military is guilty of even more aggression in cyberspace, as we have just heard from my colleague from Texas. They've stolen dozens of our defense systems. They have vast amounts of intellectual property they've stolen, as well as the business records for many of our companies. The damage has been estimated in the trillions of dollars. Any cooperation with the Chinese military only weakens our own moral credibility and discourages our allies in the face of threats from Communist China. We should be drawing a clear distinction between us and the Chinese military, not helping them train to become even more efficient. I call on my colleagues to vote for Congressman Stockman's terrific amendment, and again, making sure that we stand up and are counted when there is a threat to the freedom and stability of the world.
I reserve the balance of our time.
The gentleman reserves. For what purpose, the gentleman from Indiana rise?
Rise to claim the time in opposition to the gentleman's amendment.
The gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 5 minutes in opposition.
The gentleman's amendment seeks to block funds for our military to participate in any exercise in which China participates as well. Chinese president confirmed last month in meetings with President Obama his Navy's attendance to participate in the Rim of the Pacific, known as RIMPAC, in 2014. An invitation to participate had been extended to China during then-Secretary of Defense Panetta's visit to that country in September of 2012. RIMPAC is the world's largest international maritime exercise where 28 countries and more than 40 ships and submarines work together. In 2012, not all participants were our traditional allies. Russia, for example, India, for example, were participants. I believe the amendment is short-sighted and attempts to place an unneeded stumbling block in the path of a relationship that is tenuous. And I would suggest that the Secretary would not have extended the invitation if the Department and the United States Navy did not feel that there would be a benefit to be gained by these exercises with the Chinese participation. I refuse to believe, as a member of the United States Congress, that the Department would take such a position. The United States gains maritime knowledge and renewed relationships with other navies of the world and considers participation in this exercise as crucial to their mission. RIMPAC participation has gained an ever greater meaning with the Defense Department's rebalance to the Asia-Pacific, and do think that this amendment should not be adopted by the House. I would reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Indiana reserves. The gentleman from Texas.
Out that the military works for Congress, not the other way around. So if we direct the military to do something, they do it. It's if they object, they're not going to object and say we're not going to do it. We're the body that controls the military, and we're responsible for this nation's future. And it's so on the face of it, so obvious what we're doing is giving away our secrets. I can tell you right now that they've stole the plans to the F-22. They're building more F-22s than we are. They're not part of the negotiation for nuclear weapons right now. We only negotiate with Russia. We have no idea how many weapons they have. We have no idea how many nuclear weapons they have. We are blind-spotted by what they're doing. They're shooting down satellites, and they could blind us. But anyhow, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Texas yields back. The gentleman from Indiana.
I appreciate the gentleman and would agree with his assertion that we do have civilian command of the Department of Defense and the United States Navy. God bless the United States Navy, they follow orders. But also, having dealt with the Navy for some number of years as a member of this subcommittee, I would suggest to my colleagues if the Navy had reservations or had some concerns, we would have had a whiff of that objection and concern wafting from the Potomac to this particular building. And I have not sensed that myself, and I would yield to the gentleman from New Jersey.
Let me associate, thank you, the gentleman for let me associate myself with Mr. Vostotsky's remarks. I think there's some benefit for us to have joint military. They may learn something about us. We may learn something about them. And I can assure you the committee is in a state of denial. We know the Chinese are very aggressive, setting out a strategy for a blue Navy. And I think these joint exercises may be extremely beneficial to us in terms of their strategy, their naval strategy, and to be part of an overall Pacific Rim program gives us a pretty good opportunity to take a look at their capabilities. I thank the gentleman for
Appreciate the gentleman's remark and would yield back my time.
Gentleman from Indiana yields back. The questions on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. The gentleman from Texas.
I ask for a recorded vote.
The gentleman asks for a recorded vote. Pursuant to Clause 6, Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 61, printed in House Report 113-170. For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 61, printed in House Report number 113-170, offered by Mr. Turner of Ohio.
Pursuant to House Resolution 312, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Turner, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment would restrict President Obama from unlawfully divesting our nation's strategic delivery systems. Since the enactment of the New START Treaty in 2010, the President has continued to jeopardize the security of the United States by unilaterally pursuing policies and international agreements that call for the drastic reduction of our nation's nuclear deterrent. Not only are these proposed policies and agreements harmful to the United States, but also they are in violation of standing laws such as the Arms Control and Disarmament Act, which states that international agreements cannot limit or reduce the military forces of the United States unless enacted pursuant to a treaty or congressional executive agreement. It is unfortunate that amendments such as this one have become necessary, as the President chooses to ignore the role of Congress when negotiating arms reductions. As recently as last month, President Obama delivered a speech in Berlin in which he outlined his plan to further reduce nuclear warheads by as much as 1/3. Since that time, the administration has given no indication that he would seek to negotiate or seek to Senate ratification of a formal treaty as required by law. Instead, the administration continues to engage directly with the Russian Federation while averting a formal treaty process in coordination with the Senate. These drastic reductions by the President are ill-conceived and have only encouraged the further proliferation of nuclear weapons by countries like Russia, China, and North Korea, which continue to expand the nuclear weapons programs. This amendment seeks to rein in the President's misguided policies by ensuring that none of the appropriated funds be used to reduce the strategic delivery systems of the United States in contravention of Section 303B of the Arms Control and Disarmament Act. Mr. Chairman, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Ohio reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Indiana rise?
Claim time in opposition to the gentleman's amendment.
The gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 5 minutes in opposition to the amendment.
We have had a number of amendments in this vein this evening, and again, I would allude back to some of my earlier comments that we have proposals and discussions and consideration taking place, and I don't think it's our duty to stop all of that from happening. The fact is, none of these weapons have ever been used in the United States or elsewhere on the planet Earth. And I would hope, as an institution, we would take this much time to consider the asymmetrical threats that have occurred against this country and its citizens and our allies across the country, such as the attack on the USS Cole, the USS bombings in Tanzania and Kenya, the events of 2001. Think about the instability and strategic challenges we face now in Egypt, in Syria, in Libya, in North Africa. The continuing challenge of Iran that supports terrorist organizations with regional and global aims. The effort that we are going to have to put into the prioritization of an Asian Pacific region focus with a particular emphasis on China and North Korea, and the instantaneous and continual attack by cyber against our nation and our assets. Again, as far as deliberation and consideration, I don't think we should simply be here all evening saying no, no, no. The President, obviously, if there is any further reduction according to a treaty, would have to have that ratified by the United States Senate. So I do oppose the gentleman's amendment and would reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Indiana reserves. The gentleman from Ohio.
Well, with all due respect from the gentleman from Indiana, I won't question his historical description of the issues of the use of nuclear weapons, although I find it confusing. I will say, though, that this resolution, this amendment in its terms are not about the issue of the use of or even the number of weapons the United States or Russia might have. This is about the Constitution and the laws of the United States. All this says is that the President has to follow the Constitution, make certain that he seeks Senate ratification of any formal treaty, or that he conform with the Arms Control Disarmament Act, which would prohibit him unilaterally taking action. The concern and the reason why this amendment is necessary is because the President felt the need to actually leave this country and go to another country and announce his intention, perhaps, to undertake unilaterally, both as President and unilaterally without even getting a bilateral agreement with another nation, and his intention of further reducing our nuclear weapons. This amendment is not about numbers, it's about the law, and it's about our Constitution, and it's about upholding it and requiring that the President of the United States conform to it in something certainly as important as our national security. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman from Ohio yields back. The gentleman from Indiana.
I will yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Ohio. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 62, printed in House Report 113-170. For what purposes, the gentlewoman from Indiana seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 62, printed in House Report number 113-170, offered by Mrs. Walorski of Indiana.
Pursuant to House Resolution 312, the gentlewoman from Indiana, Ms. Walorski, is recognized, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Indiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In May, the President declared a renewed intention to transfer detainees from Guantanamo. He also announced he was lifting his self-imposed suspension on the transfers of detainees to Yemen. I believe it's a dangerous policy, both for our troops fighting terror overseas and for our citizens living in the homeland. The amendment I'm offering prohibits any funds in the defense bill from being used to transfer Gitmo detainees to Yemen. This amendment is similar to an amendment I offered and this House passed during consideration of the FY14 NDAA. I believe this amendment is needed because detainees at Guantanamo Bay represent some of the most dangerous terrorists in the world. After Yemen was the starting point for the foiled airline bombing over Detroit, the Obama administration correctly decided not to transfer these terrorists back to this troubled nation. Detainees at Gitmo pose a real threat to our national security. In addition, transfers to Yemen should be prohibited because the country has become a hotbed for terrorist activity. The Director of National Intelligence testified in 2011 that AQAP remains the affiliate most likely to conduct a transnational attack. AQAP remains resolute on killing as many Americans as they can if we don't stop them first. It makes no sense to send terrorists to a country where there is an active al-Qaeda network that we know has been engaged in targeting the U.S. The Christmas Day Detroit bombing attempt, the ink cartridge bomb plot, the radicalization of the forehead shooter all can be traced back to Yemen. Lastly, we should not transfer detainees to Yemen because of their poor track record of securing its prisons. Let's look at the facts. A Yemeni citizen, the convicted mastermind of the USS Cole bombing, who took the lives of 17 American sailors, was being held by Yemeni authorities when he escaped from prison in 2003. Luckily, he was recaptured, but he was able to escape again from Yemeni custody in 2006 with 22 other terrorists. Why would we risk another jailbreak by people who intend to do us harm? Just this morning, I woke up to headlines describing how 500 prisoners escaped from an Iraqi prison after their comrades launched a military-style assault to free them. Many of these prisoners were senior members of al-Qaeda who were convicted and received death sentences. Unfortunately, it's an example of what happens when the U.S. delegates its national security interests to other countries. This is a common-sense amendment with the purpose of protecting Americans. I believe it's prudent that this Congress receive the Department of Defense's report on factors that contribute to re-engagement so that informed choices about future transfers can be made. That report is mandated by law and is still currently overdue. In 2012, the DIA reported that the combined suspected and confirmed re-engagement rate of former Gitmo detainees has risen to almost 30%. I ask my colleagues to consider the national security implications of transferring detainees to Yemen and join me in support of this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady reserves. Does anyone seek recognition?
I would claim time in opposition and would reserve my time.
The gentleman from Indiana is recognized and now reserves. Lady from Indiana.
I'd like to yield. Can I inquire to the balance of my time, Mr. Chair?
The gentlelady has 2 1/4 minutes. The gentleman from Indiana has 5 minutes.
I'd like to yield a minute and a half to my good friend from the state of Oklahoma, Representative Bridenstine.
The gentleman is recognized for a minute and a half.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of the Walorski Amendment to prohibit transfer or release of Guantanamo Bay detainees to Yemen. Mr. Chairman, over the weekend, hundreds of convicts, including senior members of al-Qaeda, broke out of Iraq's Abu Ghraib jail. The Abu Ghraib prison break perfectly demonstrates that most countries cannot credibly secure highly dangerous terrorists, including Yemen. Indeed, Yemen has a particularly bad record of prison breaks involving al-Qaeda terrorists. In December 2011, several al-Qaeda militants escaped from an Aden prison. In 2006, 23 al-Qaeda militants broke out of a Sana'a jail and established the core leadership of al-Qaeda in Yemen, a group which has since metastasized into al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Given Yemen's terrible track record, it seems obvious that we should not consider transferring a single detainee to Yemen. Yet President Obama is so ideologically committed to fulfilling his misguided promise of closing Guantanamo Bay that I fear he may try. Mr. Chairman, recidivism among the transferred Gitmo detainees is a huge problem. According to the Director of National Intelligence, the latest report, 97 of the 603 transferred Gitmo detainees have re-engaged in terrorism. 97 of them. A further 72 are suspected of re-engaging. Nearly one-third of all transferred Gitmo detainees are either confirmed or suspected of getting back in the fight. Clearly, Congress needs to get involved and set acceptable boundaries on the President. As a Navy pilot with combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, I can tell you that our troops' job is already difficult enough. We don't have to fight the same people twice.
I reserve the balance.
Gentlelady reserves. Gentleman from Indiana.
I would rise to claim the time.
The gentleman is recognized.
I appreciate the fact that this is the first instance that my friend and colleague from Indiana and I are participating in a debate on an amendment on the House floor, which is why I respectfully and regretfully have to oppose her amendment, as well-intentioned as it is. I do not believe that we should impose on ourselves the legal and moral problems arising from the prospect of indefinite detentions at Guantanamo. Working through civil courts since 9/11, hundreds of individuals have been convicted of terrorism or terrorism-related offenses and are now serving long sentences in federal prison. Not one has ever escaped custody. But we're told we cannot bring these detainees to the United States for trial or custody. And we are told in 3 other instances in the bill that we cannot close Guantanamo. But I think the rationale for establishing Guantanamo in the first instance was a misplaced idea that the facility could be beyond the law, a proposition rejected by the Supreme Court. And as a result, continued operation of this facility creates the impression in the eyes of our allies and enemies alike that the United States selectively observes the rule of law. And with this amendment now we would have a fourth restriction within this bill, and I think that is not the best policy for this country to pursue, and for that reason, respectfully, I do oppose the gentlewoman's amendment and would reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlelady from Indiana.
Mr. Chairman, can I inquire on the balance of my time?
The gentlelady has 45 seconds, and the gentleman from Indiana has 3 1/4.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And with all due respect to my esteemed colleague from Indiana as well, this amendment isn't about whether Gitmo stays open or Gitmo closes. This amendment is specifically about not allowing transfers of highly dangerous terrorists to the country of Yemen, because Yemen has proved it is not capable of holding these terrorists. The job of this Congress and what we're talking about with this amendment is protecting the American people, which is what we're charged with. And I would respectfully ask our body to approve and support this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Indiana.
Time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Indiana. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The gentlelady from Indiana requests a recorded vote pursuant to Clause 6, Rule 18. Further proceedings on the amendment by the gentlewoman from Indiana will be postponed. Okay, it is now in order to consider amendment number 63, printed in House Report 113-170. It's now in order to consider amendment number 64, printed in House Report 113-170. It is now in order to consider amendment number 65, printed in House Report 113-170. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Oregon rise?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 65, printed in House Report number 113-170, offered by Ms. Bonamici of Oregon.
Pursuant to House Resolution 312, the gentlewoman from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici, is a member opposed. Each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Oregon.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself such time as I may consume. Mr. Chairman, I rise today in support of this amendment to provide our National Guard with the aircraft it needs to perform its missions effectively and efficiently. The National Guard relies on C-23 Sherpa aircraft for a variety of uses, and they're especially important for missions stateside. These small cargo aircraft transported relief supplies and personnel after Hurricanes Sandy and Katrina. They support special operations missions and training, and they aid the Guard in fighting wildfires. These planes are flexible, they can be put into use quickly, and, this is important, Mr. Chairman, they're less expensive to operate than other options. Despite opposition from the National Guard Association of the United States and from governors around this country, the Army now wants to eliminate use of the Sherpa. The C-130 planes they propose using instead are almost 2 times as expensive to operate. Plus, eliminating the Sherpa would require that the Guard rely on the Air Force for the use of planes. This would add up to a week to access planes, cutting off the Guard's ability to be responsive and flexible. Additionally, the Sherpa is extremely popular with the special operations community. Last year, the House voted to prohibit the Sherpa's retirement. My amendment would uphold current law and prevent the retirement, divestment, or transfer of C-23 aircraft. It would also ensure their continued viable operation, preventing the Army from getting around the law by mothballing the Sherpa into flyable storage. Mr. Chairman, I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this amendment. Let's listen to the men and women of the National Guard and support their success to the fullest extent possible. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady reserves. What purposes? The gentleman from New Jersey rise.
Mr. Chairman, I rise to claim time in opposition.
The gentleman is recognized in opposition for 5 minutes.
I rise reluctantly to oppose your amendment. The Army has made it clear to our committee that it does not want to retain the C-23s, the Sherpas, the workhorses that have been doing some remarkable work for over 30 years, or require any replacement platform. In fact, the Army has already taken steps to put the aircraft out of operation while stopping short of full retirement. At the beginning of fiscal year 2013, the Army National Guard was operating 34 of these Sherpas. As of July, 14 of those had been turned in to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where they're being maintained in semi-flyable storage. That tells you something. The remaining aircraft are scheduled to be turned in to Fort Sill by the end of October of this year. Because this amendment only applies to fiscal year 2014, the aircraft likely will be out of operation before this amendment would take effect. Unfortunately, because the C-23s will already be in storage by the time this amendment takes effect, it's unlikely it will accomplish its intent. We do not believe that taking funds from other critical readiness programs to apply to the C-23 operations is the best use of the Army's increasingly limited resources, and thus reluctantly I oppose this amendment and retain the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Oregon.
Thank you. Reclaiming my time, I do appreciate the comments of the Chair. However, if we're talking about limited resources, it makes so much more sense to use planes that are less expensive, give the men and the women of the National Guard the flexibility and the aircraft that they need. I do ask, Mr. Chairman, for a recorded vote. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment.
The gentlelady yield back.
I'm sorry, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from New Jersey.
Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Oregon. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I do request a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6, Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Oregon will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 66, printed in House Report 113-170. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Hawaii seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 66, printed in House Report number 113-170, offered by Ms. Hanabusa of Hawaii.
Pursuant to House Resolution 312, the gentlewoman from Hawaii, Ms. Hanabusa, and the member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Hawaii.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, in the President's budget the past 2 years, there's been a push to place a substantial TRICARE fee increases. Even the TRICARE for Life program, the promise of lifelong health care many were given when they first joined the military, has been the subject of proposed enrollment fees. The House Armed Services Committee, of which I am a member, and other congressional defense committees have declined to grant the authority for these fee increases. My amendment will do nothing more than ensure that the funds in this act are not made available to implement any new enrollment fees in the TRICARE for Life program. Year after year, we hear from the Defense Department that health care costs of our soldiers and veterans are spiraling out of control, and that TRICARE is crippling the DoD with its rise in costs. Yet, Mr. Speaker, for the past 2 fiscal years, the Pentagon has found a way to reprogram hundreds of millions of dollars from defense health accounts to higher priorities. These reprogramming actions totaled $708 million last year in 2012 and $500 million in the prior year in 2011. DoD has explained that the surplus was due to uncertainty about medical inflation and health care use and the impact of continual benefit changes and efficiency initiatives. If there is uncertainty about costs, the assertion cannot be made that added fees are necessary for even our most senior veterans. DoD's own documents prove military health care costs are not exploding. The combined personnel and health care costs are less than 1/3 of DoD's budget, and the same as they've been for 30 years. The overestimation of cost growth that has resulted in hundreds of millions of dollars being reprogrammed by DOD the past 2 years is proof that costs are not growing as much as anticipated. In fact, they're not growing at all. The relatively low cost of health care and strong benefits are the fundamental elements, and they are necessary not just to recruit, but also to sustain an all-volunteer force. Significant cuts to the critical incentive packages that sustain a top-quality career force will undermine long-term retention and readiness. I ask my colleagues to vote for this amendment and uphold our commitment to the brave men and women of our armed services, as well as the millions of veterans in need of health care today. And again, I reemphasize this amendment is to prohibit funds to be used to add any enrollment fees to TRICARE for Life program. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Indiana rise?
I rise to claim time in opposition to the gentlewoman's amendment.
The gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 5 minutes in opposition.
I would begin my remarks by suggesting that I deeply appreciate the gentlewoman's concern and her commitment to make sure everyone who has taken that oath of office and put on the uniform of the United States of America receives the health care benefits they deserve and that they have earned. But I would point out, as I have on a number of occasions this evening, that we have got to start looking ahead and begin to make some very difficult decisions. I would quote again from the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments that has noted that over the last decade, rather than getting larger and more expensive, the military has just grown more expensive. This reality makes our future choices even more difficult, and it is imperative that Congress joins with the Department in working through these decisions at an arm's length relationship, but also as a partner. The Department has made recommendations, one of which we are debating at this moment, that are very difficult decisions to have to make. On the other hand, we have to begin to not reflexively reject these recommendations out of hand. I understand what the gentlewoman is trying to do with her amendment, but she does rightfully describe it as saying that no funds shall be used to implement an enrollment fee. Is that enrollment fee 25 cents? Is that enrollment fee $1? Is that enrollment fee $2? Is that enrollment fee $250 for an individual and $500 for a family? We are going to have to consider the pressure that the budget is under. The gentlewoman has indicated that the Department has reprogrammed money, and that means that, in fact, costs have not gone up. The fact is, I do believe that the Department has, if you would, under-executed and over-requested monies in past years. The subcommittee mark in the bill we are debating tonight cut $400 million from the request of $15.8 billion based on the execution history. We would not have done that if we thought we had endangered anyone's health. And the fact is, costs are going up. The cost of military medical care has risen almost by triple in the past 12 years, rising from $19 to $56 billion. If the increase continues at this rate for another decade, coupled with sequestration, military health care could consume close to 20% of all defense spending. According to a report published by the Congressional Budget Office entitled Long-Term Implications of the 2013 Future Year Defense Program, the annual cost of the Department's health care program could grow from $51 billion in fiscal year 13 to $65 billion in 2017 and $90 billion by 2030. If we continue to block enrollment fees for TRICARE for Life, defense funding for this program will place other programs at risk. The Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments estimates that pay and benefits for each active duty service member grew by 57% in real terms between 2001 and 2012, or 4.2 annually. I'm not suggesting our service members do not deserve adequate compensation for the risks they take in the defense of this country, but we have to understand what the growth of those costs means for the overall budget and the future implications. Operational and maintenance costs per active duty employee grew by 34%. I oppose the amendment respectfully because I am worried that if we don't address the rising costs of health care now, there will be even a smaller pool of resources to make our military ready in the future, and would reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Indiana reserves, the gentlelady from Ohio.
Thank you. I reclaim the balance of my time.
Gentlelady's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the comments of the ranking member. However, the facts are as stated. DOD has reprogrammed $708 million last year alone and $500 million in the prior year, and these have been from the health accounts. In addition to that, we must look at the fact that the DOD budget, as to personnel and health costs, are less than one-third of the DOD budget, and that's been a consistent percentage for the past 30 years. The health care fund has been the one that has been taking the hit every time. It's been the boogeyman to say that's where we're going to have to cut, and that's what's rising the costs out of control. It's spiraling out of control, but that's in fact not true. And I think that to threaten health care or to not give our men and women in uniform and the veterans in particular the security with which they joined the military for. These are one of the benefits they looked for. By not being able to ensure them that, especially health care, is the worst that we can do. When we don't have the evidence that this is where we should cut, we should not cut and add any additional enrollment fees. And as I stated, this amendment is to prevent any funds to be used to increase any enrollment fees for the TRICARE for Life. And I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Indiana.
That's my time.
Yields back his time. The questions on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Hawaii. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey rise?
I move that the committee now do rise.
The question on the motion that the committee rise, all those in favor say aye. All those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the committee rises. Mr. Speaker, the Committee of the Whole House and the State of the Union, having had under consideration H.R. 2397, directs me to report that it has come to no resolution thereon.
The Chair of the Committee of the Whole House and the State of the Union reports that the committee has had under consideration H.R. 2397 and has come to no resolution thereon. The Chair lays before the House the following personal requests.
Leave of absence requested for Mr. Coble of North Carolina for today and tomorrow, Mr. Horsford of Nevada for Monday, July 22nd, and today.
Without objection, the requests are granted. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to adjourn.
Question is on the motion to adjourn. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the House stands adjourned until 10 a.m. today for morning hour debate.
The House today is beginning consideration of the 2014 defense spending bill, with up to 100 amendments allowed. The $513 billion measure is $28 billion more than the Pentagon's 2013 levels, which reflect the current sequestration spending cuts. The bill also includes $86 billion for the war in Afghanistan. Among the amendments being offered, one that would restrict the NSA's data collection authority. also several blocking aid to Syrian opposition forces and the Egyptian military. The White House yesterday issued a veto threat to the 2014 defense spending bill, saying in a statement that the lack of spending cuts within the bill would, quote, hurt our economy and require draconian cuts to middle-class priorities, end quote. Watch live House coverage when members return here on C-SPAN.